Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to present the overall strategy that Nyaya philosophy has for defending the existence of the self in response to the Buddhist challenge. In the lectures that follow this one, I'll go through the different arguments one by one that instantiate this strategy. First, let us remind ourselves what the Buddhist challenge is. As we saw previously, Buddhist philosophers reject the existence of the self when we understand by self a specific type of thing, namely as a substance or thing, as something enduring or permanent, and as something that determines itself. On the Buddhist view, the self doesn't exist as a thing. Rather, there's what we call persons, which are bundles of various psychological states that extend through time, but ultimately each aspect of those bundles loses its existence, and so isn't really permanent. The bundle as a whole isn't permanent because each aspect depends on other things. And it's that view that everything depends on something else that means that the self, as something that would determine itself all on its own and be in control of itself, means that that can't really exist. And that's why life is full of suffering, because we're not really in control of ourselves, because there is no self to be in control of. What Nyaya philosophy needs to do is explain some grounds or reasons for thinking that there is a self that is a substance or thing, and not just a process, that the self is something that endures through time, and has some sort of control over itself. And indeed, we find arguments for each of those three aspects. But what I need to do now is explain the general argumentative strategy. First, recall that on Nyaya philosophy, ultimately there are four distinct kinds of knowledge sources: perception, inference, analogy, and testimony. Now, this is relevant because if we are to have knowledge of the self's existence, we need to have it through one or more of those sources of knowledge, those pramanas. And indeed, Nyaya philosophy holds that we have knowledge of the self through the second of those knowledge sources, inference. And so one of the sutras says that, quote, inferential marks for the self are desire, aversion, effort, pleasure, pain, and knowledge, end quote. So note the phrase inferential marks. We have knowledge of the self through inference, and we infer the self from things such as desire, aversion, effort, and so on. One way to think of this is that these things, desire, aversion, effort, and so on, are kind of data. And this data can only be explained by positing the existence of a self. The aim of the Nyaya philosophers is to show by inference and argument that there is a self. We can also see why they focus on inference rather than the other things. The Nyaya philosophers could not respond to the Buddhist philosophers by saying that we have perception of a self, because the Buddhists can say, well, maybe you have that perception, but I don't. I don't directly have awareness of a self. Likewise, analogy isn't so suitable, because with analogy, you're comparing the various features of two different things and saying how they are similar. But you need to know, first of all, that the two things exist. And so analogy presupposes the existence of something like the self, if you're to compare the self to other things. And finally, testimony is going to be something that you know from someone else. But the Buddhist is going to say that we don't know the self's existence through testimony because it's something that doesn't exist in the first place. So this leaves only inference as something that can show the existence of the self in response to the Buddhist philosopher. And so the Nyaya philosopher needs to appeal to premises that the Buddhist philosopher already accepts, and then argue that those premises entail the existence of a self, that those premises or various truths can only make sense if a self also exists. And so this leads us to the overall structure of the Nyaya argument. So the overall argument runs as follows. First, we regularly encounter the various phenomena of desire, aversion, effort, pleasure, pain, and knowledge. We have, in our experience, awareness of these different things. This is the basic data of everyone's experience, so the Buddhist philosopher cannot deny that you have those sorts of experiences. The question then is, what explains the fact that we have those experiences in the first place? The Nyaya philosopher is going to argue that these phenomena can be explained only by positing the existence of a self, and a self that has three different features: that it's substantial, that it's enduring, and that it's self-determining. That is to say, that it has each of the three features that the Buddhist philosopher denies. Now, if these first 2 points are true, then it follows that there must exist a self with those three features: that's substantial, enduring, and self-determining. So notice that the overall structure of this argument is pretty straightforward. Now, premise 1 is something that the Buddhist will easily concede. So the burden of proof here goes to the second premise, and the Nyaya philosopher needs to explain why we should believe this second premise with respect to each of those three features of the self. And so in the next lectures, we'll go through those one by one and show what the Nyaya says for why a self is needed to explain various phenomena and why that self needs to be substantial, enduring, and self-determining.